What's going on, guys? It's Derek. Today we have the full ILS lab walkthrough. This is a smaller lab than I toured out in Prague at Janoshik, but I will take the opportunity to tour any lab because they are popping up left and right in the research space. We see different COAs out there. We don't know how things are being tested. And if I can provide any community insight to you guys, that's what I want to do. I have the full walkthrough right here. Unfortunately, I got a bunch of it on horizontal footage and I got some just on cell phone footage. So I'll pop to that one after, but this is the main testing facility right here. So I'm going to do some commentary as this goes through. You can see this is the testing intake right here after samples are actually taken out of the packages from sender. Everything is paid for. They're ready to move to the next step. They have a bunch of samples scattered here. I'm assuming these are ready for the second stage of testing. One thing I want to point out, all stations you'll see have a little iPad for workflow. It's a little iPad or computer at some of them. And these right here are AirClean 600 PCR workstations. So they could be doing a couple things in these. They could either be prepping samples for sterility. They do have PCR sterility in the other room, which I'll show you. Or they could be doing 14-day sterility, which they recently added, or even prepping these samples for HPLC intake. So you'll see a couple of these, and I would be lying if I know everything what's going on in these. I just know that they prep the samples in here, and I saw people working at these workstations basically 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. when I was there on Thursday. Then you have this little refrigeration, so 33 degrees Celsius, 17 degrees Celsius. You can just keep seeing it walk through for anything that requires refrigeration. More just tables and workstations over here. I'm going to be honest, I don't know what they separate these out between. They could just be, extra workstations. I believe they had around 8 employees in this room actually working on preparing samples and running the HPLCs. And then they had another 2 doing intake and customer service. So let's walk to the next station after this. You can just see all the supplies. Over here is where the actual HPLCs machines are. You can see this is all the liquid that is required to actually inject the sample and run it through the HPLC machine properly. So this one was still being set up. It was not currently active. There's the laptops I was talking about with the little computer workstations, and this machine is the big guy on the right. This was the HPLC that was running. You can put over 100 samples into this. I will overlay what the inside of this looks like. If you don't know how this machine works, it basically injects the sample right here with water, and it will pump it through a tube right here. So I know I'm blocking it a little bit. Let me move this over. So basically, injects it through this machine. It will kind of show up as different UV rays on that little HPLC graph that you'll see, and that's how they look into the purity and net content of the actual compounds. So I will keep letting this play just so you guys can see the whole setup. This is a pretty big machine, and I got up nice and close on it. So you can see the little injector right there, and it kind of does one sample at a time, but you can load a bunch of them up together. And like I said, I will pop up the little tube that they took out. So here is how they actually run it. I just turned this laptop on so you can see the little HPLC graph as it's plotting. It'll plot all that data right in, and then that will forward to their backend software. So that runs real time. And as I go around this, you can see this is the actual intake right here. So when everybody sends their samples out, I didn't get too close on this because that has client information, but they'll send in the samples, they'll make the payment online, and then they will go validate those payments, go see what tests need to be run, input them in their internal system, and batch them out for future testing. So we're going to go through here. You can see everybody in here was wearing a lab coat when they were doing all the samples. It kind of just was a requirement, especially if they were working under the PCR hoods or any of the HPLCs in general. The only people not wearing lab coats were the people over here doing the intake process and segmenting everything out. So that was basically it. I think I did a quick 360 around this room right here. This is kind of one big space that they hope to fill with more machinery. You can see more samples in the middle. And yeah, that was the main station right there. We're going to go to the second part, which has the other tests right now. So like I said, unfortunately, I had to just record this on my iPhone vertical style. So I'll try my best to explain anything that looks a little bit small on the screen, but this is their secondary room for testing. So they have more samples in here that has to run through more HPLC work or go through the dual HPLC, and then it's got a mass spec attached to it. I'll talk about that in a second, but I kind of just did a walkthrough over here. You can kind of see I just spanned across the whole room, but they have a pretty legit setup going. For those of you that don't know, ILS has been testing cannabis since 2019. So they do have a cannabis lab in here too, and they just have their whole supply room and whole setup chain in here. More samples right there. The room that I'm going to be walking over to here in a second is the room that they have their mass spec in. That's mass spectrometry. So what it does, once I pan this around, this big machine right here, it's got the HPLC on the left side that runs it through the mass spec where it ionizes all the different peptide particles. And basically, if I go back a little bit, it will give you that chromatograph, which will confirm the actual Dalton weight of the peptide. This is very important. They actually didn't have this until about end of April, early May. So some of the samples didn't have it, and this is what they need to actually confirm. This is very important for peptides that are popular right now, like Atomax, that's highly debated between 984 Atomax and 1032. So this machine is pretty much a requirement for any lab that wants to identify everything to the final detail. We talked about this with Janoshik as well, so it's good that they have that machinery. And that's basically it for this room right here. If I keep walking through, the room that I'm going to walk into is where they perform heavy metals testing. So this machine right here is I believe it's an ICP-MS or ICQ-MS. I might be mistaken a little bit, but this is the very precise machine that will read heavy metals. So these two are hooked up to each other. This will give a reading of any trace heavy metals, and it goes down to the very bare minimum particle. You could find arsenic in pretty much everything people don't realize, but the actual toxic amounts have to be astronomical, especially in something like a peptide. So this monitor right there actually reads the results out, and this is a little, he described it to me almost as a microwave oven to heat up the samples and get them prepped to actually go through the ICP-MS. Over here, they have the area where they actually dissolve a lot of these things. These little white tubes, they actually take any capsules or any tablets or anything like that and actually fully dissolve them before they throw them through the machinery. And it's always good to have a laminar flow hood set up. Everything in here was handled with gloves and sterile technique, and just a lot of things we don't think about. They also have their scales, which we saw at the Janoshik facility, and all their samples that are fully dissolved. So as I walk through here, you're going to see more HPLCs over here. See that guy? This is the HPLC they're currently running for a lot of the peptides. And in this room, I didn't get a clear view right here, but this is a PCR station. I will overlay another video up that kind of walks into that room when they weren't working. I didn't want to disturb that. So they throw this through a little PCR, and that's just a rapid sterility screening. So I think that's it for that major room right there. I just showed off some of the supplies and some of the scales that they have. And you saw right there, they also are a cannabis testing lab. There's one more machinery over on the end here. You can see this guy close up. I believe if I check my notes with everything, this guy at the end is, let's see if I can get closer. So yes, so this is an AOC-20s Plus. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know exactly what they do with this machine. I believe it is to help develop some testing methodologies. Overall, I just wanted to show off all the machinery, some of the stuff they were using for peptides at the time, some of the stuff they weren't using for peptides. So that's it for those right there. Like I said, I'll overlay a bunch of stuff in it, and I do want to talk a little bit about my experience over at ILS. So let's talk about ILS really quick. ILS kind of popped on the peptide scene in February 2026. A lot of companies have switched over to them because they promised 7x testing, so testing ID, sterility, net content, net purity, endotoxins, heavy metals, and conformity. Basically, if you can get that 7x testing, that's something you can use for marketing, but that's also, just the maximum amount of testing that's kind of become common in the research space. Now we also have fentanyl testing as well. So I've seen a lot of companies switch over to them, and they're out in San Diego. They are intaking a lot of clients, which is something I'll say, because a lot of small companies reach out to me, who has the cheapest testing, who has the fastest testing, and ILS used to be anywhere from a 3 to 5 day turnaround time. Unfortunately, that has fallen back as they've just taken on more and more clients, which is kind of something I've heard from the companies that I've talked to, but also in general, it looked like they were behind in the process. That's one thing a lab really hasn't nailed, is kind of the turnaround time aspect with offering the full panel. A lot of the times it'll span out anywhere from, I've seen up to 6 to 8 weeks at other labs, which is, if you're running a business on that end, 6 to 8 weeks is hard to plan for, right? So that's one thing. Turnaround time isn't great. Another thing, they've been trying to keep up with communication, but one of the things they're really struggling with is people just calling constantly, asking where their samples are, where it is in the process, how long, etc., because that turnaround time has lacked, and that's something they are working on. They are very diligent about trying to test everything and get methodologies up. Not a lot of people understand, and I was talking to the chemists. People probably hated me because I was talking to the chemist for about 2 hours about all these methodologies. The thing that he told me, capsules, tablets, nasal sprays, all these alternative form peptides are very difficult to test. You can basically run heavy metals on everything, but actually understanding the purity on these things is very difficult, especially for capsules. He basically walked me through different manufacturers put different things in capsules. So actually assigning a purity to it is difficult. You have to get into all the layers on what you determine an impurity versus what's something that's supposed to be added. Like it could just be a filler. It could be something that needs to, stabilize the capsule. They really don't know what are in those compounds. So assigning a purity is different. You can almost get a net content out of it, but even Janoshik won't really assign a purity to the actual, capsule product, because what's an impurity versus what isn't is highly debatable. They also said that certain peptides in capsule form or other things like that that aren't water soluble are very difficult, because trying to get it fully dissolved to test the actual net content of it, you might lose something. Example, dihexa is one of them. SLU, kind of not water soluble compounds. They can be difficult to actually get the net content out of. So that was something that was kind of eye-opening. Every single new product needs to have a methodology developed for it. So it's not one of those things that you switch to a brand new lab. A brand new lab, in my opinion, if there's, say, they can test everything, every amino blend, they either had to be working on methodologies for months and months and months and just have access to crazy amounts of samples, or they are kind of taking a guess on it. And that's one of the things ILS is currently working through, getting the ability to test everything. One of the things they were currently struggling with was L-carnitine, because I can kind of throw up an image. There were so many spikes on the actual graph. For L-carn, you have to determine that peak and then filter out all the noise of what's actually supposed to be in there. So something like a very complex amino blend, like something like L-carn, B vitamins, all this extra stuff, you have to segment out everything individually. So main takeaway from a smaller lab that just started versus someone more developed like a Janoshik is overall testing methodologies, which people don't take into account. So that's one thing. You're kind of paying for that experience, and you're also, just paying because they've seen hundreds of samples over the years. So that was a big takeaway for me. What I will say on the overall process and overall chain of custody, everything looked good from that end. I have heard there's been some communication issues between clients and actual, the lab itself. There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect there, but with any business, especially if you're scaling up, you have to find that balance and find what you're comfortable accepting business-wise while keeping your standards high. So definitely something that can be improved. That's just my feedback from what I've heard from both sides and kind of seeing it. It seemed like they were a little bit rushed in some aspects because, they were a little bit behind. Other than that, no really real complaints from the actual lab experience itself. They have about 3 HPLCs machines running. As they need more, they will add in more. However, that's going to be with any lab that's starting up, right? You can't just have unlimited machinery. You need to hire the right people, develop the right methodologies. And yeah, overall, it was a very good lab tour. I wanted to show you guys the process, and, anybody testing with them, that's some good insight if you haven't seen the lab yourself. So hope this helps. I will put out some more content, which I got some, insight onto the actual mass spec and machine specific stuff. But this was the overall tour, and I appreciate you guys. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already.